Bread is a staple of diets throughout the world and comes in many forms. Its origins predate written history, but we almost certainly have the Romans to thank for bringing the art of bread making to Britain, together with technical advances in producing flour, including the rotary millstone and the watermill. In Saxon Britain, wheat was something of a luxury. The main cereal crops were rye, barley, and oats. But it wasn't until a few centuries later, during the Norman conquest, that wheat entered the mainstream, along with a newfound popularity for baking with yeast to make leavened bread. The Normans were prolific beer makers and therefore had plentiful supplies of yeast, and so bread making, much as we know it to this day, was established. English bread was generally made of mixed grains until well into the Victorian age. Barley and rye breads were cheaper and took longer to digest. They were favoured by labourers and the working classes, while the rich enjoyed expensive white bread made from wheat. By the early part of the 19th century, cheap imported wheat was becoming plentiful. It was milled at sea and river ports and distributed via an expanding rail network to growing urban populations, much to the detriment of rural wind and water mills. In a bid to protect the livelihood of arable farmers and millers, Parliament imposed heavy taxes on imported wheat. The price of bread rocketed to as much as 2 shillings and sixpence a loaf at a time when some wages were little more than 3 shillings a week. But such was the public outcry that the tax was repealed in 1846 and bread prices fell sharply. With the availability of cheaper bread, demand rose steeply. The average family of 6 would consume a staggering 25 kilograms or 55 pounds of bread every week, the equivalent of 31 of today's sliced white loaves. Manual workers on the land and in factories, or as here at Morwellham Quay working the mines, consumed up to 6,500 calories a day, twice the recommended intake for our sedentary lives today. In impoverished rural communities, it was not uncommon for bread to be baked in communal ovens, as many households were simply too poor to afford an oven of their own. At Morwellham, the lime kilns provided a ready source of heat, which many villagers used for bread making. But in 1859, George Collard set up a successful bakery business here in Morwellham, a sign of just how lucrative the busy port had become, with demand from the local community as well as visiting ships and traders in copper ore and minerals. In the expanding towns and cities across Britain, such too was the demand for bread, and in particular the fashion for white bread, that bakers were known to find ways to make ingredients go further. All manner of things were added to the flour, including plaster of Paris, potato, chalk, and even sawdust. But the most disturbing additive was alum, a chemical compound which, in addition to whitening the bread, would inhibit the absorption of nutrients and cause sickness and diarrhea that could often prove fatal, particularly for children. However, there is no evidence that George Collard was party to such malpractices. The working conditions for bakers were often appalling. The grueling task of kneading huge amounts of dough by hand, the heat from the ovens and stale air laden with flour dust often resulted in lung disease and premature heart conditions. A journeyman baker was lucky to survive beyond 50 years of age, with many dying or too sick to work by the time they reached their 30s. Victorian bakers would work upwards of 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, and when the baking was finished, it was common for them to go door to door selling their wares from baskets or handcarts. They also supplied groceries and village stores, like the one here at Morwellham. Conditions for rural bakers were generally somewhat better, although long hours and physical exertion still took their toll, and it wasn't until the 20th century that mechanisation began to emerge in the form of dough mixers and steam ovens. Soon, dedicated high street bakery shops began appearing, some selling cakes and biscuits alongside their loaves. In 1930, the first sliced bread received much acclaim for its convenience, although its squidgy texture and bland appearance wasn't quite to everyone's taste. There is nothing so evocative as the smell of real, freshly baked bread. Today, small artisan bakeries are flourishing, and even supermarkets offer a wide range of specialty breads. And although we consume only a fraction of the bread our Victorian ancestors did, it's still a necessary and enjoyable part of our diet. In the words of Isabella Beeton, the Victorian doyenne of domestic propriety, writing in her Book of Household Management in 1892, "In our own times, and among civilized peoples, bread has become an article of food of the first necessity, and properly so, for it constitutes of itself a complete life sustainer. The gluten, fibrin, fat, phosphates, starch and sugar which it contains representing all the necessary classes of food."